Hi, I'm Jeremy, or Dr. J,
I'm Ronnie West.
and this is Good Parents, Good Children.
Parent like your kid's life depends on it.
One of the things we start off with is that war is usually an evil. You and I have talked a bit about this and considered, is war always an evil because it always involves the loss of life and the threat of force and actual force, but at least it's an evil on one side, because at least one side is corrupt and invasive and imposing their will on another.
Somebody's a bad guy, right? There could be two bad guys, or there could be a bad guy and a sort of good guy, or a bad guy and a pretty good guy, but there's not going to be two bad guys.
Sure, there are one or more bad guys in war.
Right.
And in bad guy, we don't necessarily mean black hat in a Western. We mean actively, objectively evil. And
right. And I mean, one thing to think about that too is I think if we're going to be thinking about, one side being evil or one side being the bad guy, it's the best way to handle that would be specific. It's easy to be overly universal and overly broad. And what's better is to be more specific. This action was wrong for this reason. And one reason that's worthwhile is you'll find someone who the good guys or a good leader could do a couple of things that after the fact we look at it and we say that was unwise or that was unethical or it's evil, but then they did these other things that were good. We don't need to say they were all good or all bad necessarily. And then of course there are leaders where it's hard to find anything they do that's morally valuable or good at all. But so that's one piece, is sort of thinking about it in terms of specific choices and actions can be useful. But related to that is with war and with the media and political discussions and all of this is the question of who do you trust and how do you know things, which is really valuable to talk to our kids about, because for multiple reasons. One reason is because it has to do with the virtue of faith and the virtue of honesty and discernment and wisdom. All of those are impacted by this, knowing who to trust and how to trust, and knowing how to transition from trusting someone to trusting them less or not trusting them. All of that's really important and it's vital. And in my opinion, I mean, over the last 2 years with everything going on with COVID and all of that, we can learn some lessons from that. But also in this situation, I noticed people that I had seen telling lies, I was finding myself mostly agreeing with. And there's sort of a principle when you're trying to figure out what do you know, or what can you trust, who can you trust. If people that are known liars start saying things that make a lot of sense, well, that could just be great news. Now you're able to be unified about something, and this is something we can rally around, and that's great. But you should also tread carefully, because there's a chance there's something else happening. Not that we need to know what it is. I'm not interested in impossible to prove conspiracy theories or confusing. That's just even more confusing. I just don't want to be too confident in my conclusions without enough evidence. And of course, a lot of the time in our discussion, I think we're going to be talking about this in a way that would be appropriate for like college students. So when we're talking about what do you say about war with your kids, what do you say about political leadership, what do you say about the media, and who do you trust? We're not saying that you'd use all these words and think about talking about these things in this way to your 5-year-old, but your 5-year-old, your 10-year-old, your 15-year-old, you can talk about some of these things with all of those ages. You just have to choose the age appropriate way to do it.
Well, and one of the things that we all have to wrestle with at some point is, how do we know anything? Our society has really embraced science as a way of knowing, which, hey, I think that's great because we're talking about empiricism and logic, but we've also embraced a certain scientism or trust in scientists, which really has to do with authority. It's the same thing that we do with media outlets. I trust this authority or I don't. I trust this authority or I don't. So when we're talking with our children about how do you think about this Russia-Ukraine conflict, or what does a kid need to understand about it? That some of it has to do less so with the specifics, because perhaps I can't know exactly. I know that I can't. Perhaps I can't know exactly, but what are some of the broader things that we can know? I can
Principles.
usefuls, and I can usually know what I see with my eyes. Now, I grant I can't perfectly know even that there is an invasion because I haven't been over there. I can't use empiricism, but I've seen it from enough sources, right, to believe it, to have faith in it. Enough people have independently said that Putin poisons and kills his political opponents, so I figure that's probably true. You know, there's enough reaction going on that I think we get to deal with. Why is there still war?
Okay, so I was chatting with somebody who I know, is a very smart person.
Mhm.
And I asked, what do you think, just open-ended, what do you think about the Ukraine-Russian conflict, just to see
Yeah.
what he had to say. And his first response was really interesting. He said, it's 2022, why is there still war at all? And that kind of took me back, only for a second, because I knew some people sort of thought along those lines. And I was like, well, there's always going to be war, because war is wanting to take things from people by force. So until that isn't part of human nature, in other words, never, it'll always be part of human nature.
Mhm.
As long as that's part of human nature, as long as that's a temptation people have, that they would like to get things they haven't earned. When you get things you didn't earn, you got it from someone else who earned it, or who also got it from somebody else who
Yeah.
earned it. Like somewhere down the line, like there's thieves until you get to the person who actually earned it. So you either stole from somebody who earned it, or you stole from the thief who stole from somebody who earned it. So there's always that temptation to take things that are not earned by force or threat of force. And if individuals are willing to do that, well, then you better believe that political leaders and countries are wanting to do that. And they'll come up with whatever slim rationale they need in order for them to do it. So all through 2020, and lots of other times, we've seen rioters and looters, and they take advantage of a crisis and political chaos and confusion to steal stuff so that they can sell it for their own selfish reasons. And they might, they'll come up with whatever excuses to do this. But as long as that's happening on the individual level, and as long as we see that children are tempted to lie and take things that aren't theirs and this sort of thing, there's going to be wars. So it's within our nature. So this utopian sort of idea that we could somehow have long-term worldwide peace. So there'd be peace, and the peace would be of a scale that it covers the entire planet, and it'd be of a time period that would be ongoing for a long period of time. It's silliness. I mean, there's some really smart people that seem to think that this is a goal that is possible, but I think that they've deceived themselves. This is not realistic. What's realistic is I individually, personally pursue virtue and competence.
Mhm.
I train my children to pursue virtue and competence. I'm an example of it. And to the best of my ability, I can try to elect people that appear to be doing a better job of that than the alternatives. I can do all of those things. And if our society embraces a pattern of pursuing virtue and competence, as a whole overall, well, then our society has a shot at avoiding unnecessary wars. So, individually, I can avoid unnecessary conflict, and I can help within my sphere of influence. I can make unnecessary conflict happen less often. Maybe that can happen on a bigger scale, like on a country scale. That's certainly possible, but you can't do that worldwide. I mean, there's going to be people that are taking and stealing. We're stuck with it. And I think
Well,
that's
this
a
is
worthwhile thing to share with your kids, to let them know what their responsibility is, and the fact that there's going to always be plenty of people that are not fulfilling that responsibility.
now I think you're really on the right track, because we're talking about how do we understand these global things at a close level, right? The in your home level. And this false utopia really starts with the rejection of morals. It sounds like it's this great moral possible achievement. Hey, we're going to live in a world that doesn't have any war. But actually, when you say there's not going to be any war, it's a denial that new people are coming into the world, new children all the time, and that new children are coming into the world. And unlike the rest of us, they don't have any temptations to lie or cheat or steal or be selfish or be prideful, right? Because this is really this leftist idea of the rejection of an objective morality. Because when you get to deny that there's a moral, then you get to say, okay, all we have to do is pretend everybody's okay, and then we'll all get along. Instead, when you say that there are things that are wrong or evil, then you get to build up virtue in the individual, but that takes time for all of us.
Well, and I think you were kind of alluding to this, or at least something you said made me think of it, and that is there's sort of the bury your head in the sand strategy to deal with a threat, right? It's like, this is too ugly for me to look at it. And it's too ugly for me to tell myself the truth about it and then respond rationally about that truth. So instead of doing that, I'm going to just pretend it doesn't exist, right? So, if you're in a really, really rough neighborhood and you can't leave, or you choose not to leave, whatever the situation is, you could just ignore that you're in a really rough neighborhood. And then maybe you're at a higher risk of getting, being the victim of a crime. Or you can learn how to defend yourself, or, carry mace, or, a gun, or whatever it is that you need to do to protect yourself. And then you are looking at the reality with eyes wide open. Well, that's definitely true on the country scale. If somebody tells themselves a lie, oh, we can have peace, we don't need to worry about this, well, then they're free to ignore threats, right? They tell themselves the lie. Well, now they don't have to spend their country's resources on defense. They can spend their country's resources on whatever pet projects they want, and ignore this reality that evil, strong leaders that are competent, but they're selfish, if they perceive weakness, will take advantage. They'll use threats of violence and actual violence to take what they want. So what's the antidote to strong, competent, but evil leaders is strong, competent, and virtuous leaders that are there making it so that it appears as though that's not going to work out. You can't stop someone who's willing to abuse their power by not having power. That won't work. The way that you stop someone who wants to abuse their power is by being powerful and boldly saying, no, I'm not going to let you do that.
Well, and by being a legitimate moral source, by being strong and powerful, and being built up as virtuous. Because one selfish power versus one selfish power is just going to butt heads at each other and then spread out into the surrounding countries. And I think we can understand this when we take it back to the playground level of individualism, right? So if we imagine little Vlad being a bully on his playground and annexing the Foursquare and
impaling people like Vlad does, right?
Like Vlad.
No, that's Vlad.
Does.
Sorry, it's the wrong A. Never mind.
Well, fair enough. Remember that the way children show up is wilded, right? The way children show up is all id. Babies show up very selfish, very egocentric. That's how they're built. And then it's the parents' job to insert virtue into them, to try to make them selfish, to try to teach them about kindness, and not to mention to try to teach about honesty and respect, which are some of the virtues that are being violated in the current conflict. And so long as we have people coming into the world, there's going to be selfishness, there's going to be prideful, there's going to be disrespect. Why would we think that that's going to change? But you can understand it with a bully in a playground situation. Why would it be any different on the world stage? It's especially not going to be different when the Russian country isn't able to respond to Putin. And that's why it's like you say, that we need someone strong, bold, willing, vocal, and virtuous to respond to Putin.
Right. Right. So I want to respond to a couple things you're saying there.
Mhm.
One, you alluded to this concept at the very first part of your statement there, and that is the reputation piece. Evil
Mhm.
leaders, all leaders, and everybody else all care about their reputation. And it's interesting to watch politicians who, I think are incredibly selfish, and they seem to just do whatever they want to do for their own individual situation. They're not worried about their country, or they're not worried about any other countries or whatever. They care about the story. They seem to legitimately care about their reputation, and
Mhm.
that they have what sounds like a good rationale for what they're doing. And that's an interesting feature. I don't know if it's important that they believe their story, or if it's just about reputation. They only care about how, what other people think because of how it'll impact their power later. But that does matter. And so when people are telling stories that are, they're inconsistent, they're lies, and then they use that to justify doing, invirtuous, evil things,
Mhm.
one of the attacks we can have is to show how their story doesn't add up. It doesn't
Mhm.
work. But if they're really good at lying, then they're gonna hold on tight. They're not going to say, "Oh, you're right," and back off and say, "You know what? You caught me. I should do better. I repent. Mea culpa." They're not going
Mhm.
to do that. We'll see them gaslighting, where they're going to say, you know, "No, no, no, I was right the whole time. You misunderstood for these
Right.
reasons. You're an idiot," or they'll name call or whatever. They'll try to gaslight it. But our job, if we're going to be pursuing virtue and competence and holding our leaders accountable, is to point out the inconsistencies in their story, and how that's not working. So that was one piece. Another was just a small side note. You mentioned that it's the parents' job to teach virtue to the kids, because the kids show up wilded.
It
They
is.
show up where they're just sort of, they do whatever feels right, is
Mhm.
basically the deal. There are parents who seem to think that you don't have to worry about that because it just sort of works itself out. Okay.
Mhm.
And I think that there's a reason why they think that. And for some kids, it sort of is true, right? You ride the wave of the terrible twos and the awful threes and the toddler times and all of that. And then you put them into pre-K, and the kid is socially aware enough that they
Mhm.
edit their own behavior a bit in order to fit in. And the teachers can kind of train them some, and they do a little bit better. And the parent doesn't have to press hard the whole time. So, one, that won't work for every kid. Two, that kid's not as likable. Three, they're not going to reach their potential. I don't even know how many numbers I was going for. I just started counting off like I had a list that was specific. But and I think that's really important, that they can't reach their potential. Reaching your potential is one of the best things ever. And if you start when a child's early and you help them to be likable and polite and pursue virtue the way
Mhm.
that they can when they're two, and then three, where they say please and thank you and they're polite, their teachers like them more and give them a little more attention. They make friends with older kids more easily. We talked about this a little bit during
Mhm.
our mentoring video, but I think it bears repeating, even though it's, a side note that's off topic from this. But
Well,
it's
4
important.
and number 4, what do you do if that kid is unusually shrewd and doesn't care about other people, right? So
The psychopath. Yeah.
yes, but there are budding psychopaths, in fact. And I think we can look at Putin as one of those people, because he's exceptionally shrewd, and he's demonstrated that he truly doesn't care about others. So that child, if they're also intensely selfish and ambitious, we see growing up to be one of these leaders, in his case, head of state leader. He murders his opposition. That's evil. And you told me about this dichotomy between good, evil, and legitimate, illegitimate. And he can't be fired by his citizens, so he's also illegitimate. He's a
Right.
leader who does evil, but he's a leader who doesn't belong because he can't be fired.
Yeah, there's a veil of misinformation or propaganda, or language
Mm.
barrier also. It's
Mm-hmm.
just hard. I don't have time to become an expert on Putin, Russia, and Ukraine and this whole thing. I just don't have time. I don't have the time. And I don't think most people that would watch this video have the time either. So we have to think about what can we know with a little bit of the time we have. And it's like, well, if they're telling the truth about Putin, murdering his opposition, well, that's evil. Like, I know that's evil. And if they're telling the truth about it, then he's an evil murderer. So we've got that, to know about him. And I struggle to see any really legitimate reason for this invasion. So I feel confident that was wrong.
Hi, I'm Dr. Jeremy Dale.
Hi, I'm Ronnie West.
This is Good Parents, Good Children.
Please remember to like, subscribe, and hit the bell, at least if you're a good parent.